Welcome, welcome. This is Guillermo here. I know it's been a while, but I have been taking a much needed rest and I have been doing the reading that I have been needing to make this video that I am presenting to you now. So, we're going to be talking about a topic that's I've combed the internet, I've combed YouTube, and I don't think it exists. It's the Conquest of Colombia. We've all heard of the Conquest of Mexico. Not really much about Colombia, though. So, I'm going to be reading some important excerpts from books that I managed to gather through my research skills, and we're going to learn together. So, in order to start about the Conquest of Colombia, we're going to start here. It says here, a number of All right, so that's pre-recorded. I want everybody to understand here, like, this is not a pre-recorded video. You are, in fact, hearing me live. I'm here. But at the same time, I have a lot of pre-recorded things here that we're going to be playing that I will be commenting on and adding additional information to. The main reason why I'm doing this is that way I can give you a live presentation, but at the same time, I'm not going to destroy myself by, like, just talking for an insane amount of time. Because it's very difficult to do this on your own, especially when you don't have any guests on. So I want you guys to all kind of, so I would assume most people listening to this right now as you're listening to this, you're probably familiar with the conquest of Mexico to a large degree. You probably are familiar with the conquest of Peru to maybe a smaller degree. Maybe some of you guys don't know of all the details regarding that. That's fine. But I want you guys to kind of imagine, start thinking. So imagine it's the third decade of the 16th century, right? You have a small band of Spanish adventurers and explorers. We're talking about like fewer than 200. They climb the western flank of the South American Andes, and they have timed their arrival well. The local Indian population is divided, and this is a great time to come in and be a Spaniard, when you have all of these wars going on, especially with certain types of Indian tribes. Now, it's important to understand the conflict not only allows the Spaniards to exploit these deep political divisions, it also prevents any unified defense against the newcomers who quickly plot their strategy. In accordance with the long-established military procedure in the Americas, the Spaniards seize the powerful ruler and place him under house arrest. To secure his safe release, the captive leader makes a tantalizing offer. In exchange for his freedom, he offers to fill an entire room with a treasure of precious metals and gemstones. The Spanish accept. To this point in the story, despite the overwhelming superiority of indigenous forces, not a single Spaniard has lost his life in combat. Now, what am I describing here? A lot of people might think I'm describing the conquest of Peru. I'm not at all, actually. This is Colombia. It's just very few people actually know about the actual conquest of Colombia. It's very, very unknown, actually. So it's important to give you a little bit of a preface here before we start. So in April 1536, we have a 27-year-old lawyer named Gonzalo Jimenez de Quesada, who led a military expedition from the coastal city of Santa Marta deep in the interior of what is today Colombia. With roughly 800 Spaniards and undetermined number of native carriers and black slaves, the Jimenez expedition was larger than the combined forces under Hernando Cortez, and remember, this is Hernando Cortez and Francisco Pizarro in Peru. Jimenez's men were divided into two separate groups, with 500 to 600 Spaniards marching overland, supported by more than 200 others who boarded 5 brigantes and sailed up the Magdalena River. So basically, they are coming in to do a proper conquest of Colombia. And there's a lot of important things that we're going to be going over regarding the, conquest here. So let us begin. Let's start to set the narrative here, and things are going to start picking up hopefully soon. Years had passed since the discovery of America. And yet, as late as 1509, Spain had no settlement in tierra firme. This negligence was perhaps due to the character of King Ferdinand, who, though realizing the need of settlements, did not wish to confide them to Bartholomew Columbus, but the logical person to undertake the enterprise after the death of his brother, because the monarch feared that the just claims of the latter would be as inflexible as those of the admiral. Or perhaps he did not wish to exalt Columbus's family, whose greatness was disquieting to the cautious monarch. Thus he tried to find less compromising and costly agents. Besides, it is probable that there was then no interest or enthusiasm for enterprises of conquest in a new world. Among the many adventurers in the voyages with Columbus, there was one man who fitted in best with the king's desires. This was Alonso de Ojeda, who at the time, and we're talking 1508 just for the audience here, was residing in Santo Domingo as, quote, as penniless as he was insolent and proud, end quote. The famous pilot Juan de la Cosa persuaded him to apply to the court for the command of tierra firme. Ojeda heeded this advice and commissioned the pilot to further his plans in Spain, where he counted on the support of his old friend, the powerful bishop Fonseca. Cosa was successful in his mission, even though there appeared at the same time another applicant for the position. This was Diego de Nuquesa, a courtier of noble birth who had been in the service of Don Enrique Enriquez, an uncle of King Ferdinand the Catholic. King Ferdinand, confronted by the claims of the two candidates and desiring not to offend either, granted them both offices and titles which cost him nothing and promised rich returns, but he did not contribute money or ships. He granted Ojeda the government of the region of the coast of Tierra Firme, from Cabo de la Vela to the Gulf of Uraba. This was called New Andalusia. Upon Nuesa, he conferred the region known as Castilla de Oro, to the west of the Gulf. Both had the same duties and privileges, namely to erect 2 fortresses in each jurisdiction and to pay to the crown 1/5 of all profits, the grantees being free to return to Spain and enjoy the fortune acquired. Juan de la Cosa, Ojeda's efficient agent, was appointed lieutenant governor and also alguacil mayor. The grants were for a term of 4 years, and it was provided that any disputes that might arise should be submitted to the governor of Santo Domingo. The pilot and alguacil chartered on his own account a ship and 2 brigs and sailed with 200 men. The armament was inconsiderable because the expert sailor was short of funds. On his part, Nuquesa, who had ample resources, armed 4 vessels and 2 brigs provided with an abundance of food and supplies, enough for the future colony. He assembled many people and confidently set sail. The vessels arrived at Santo Domingo, where Ojeda welcomed his friend and agent, but was mortified by the superiority of Nuquesa's outfit. Knowing his resources were inadequate, he made friends with a famous lawyer living on the island, who had accumulated thousands of dollars, and whose name was Martín Fernández de Encisco. Won over by Ojeda's offers, Encisco gave him his money and stayed in Santo Domingo for the purpose of collecting resources and with the view of following his seductive friend later. After an attempted duel between Ojeda and Diego de Nuquesca on account of boundary disputes, a duel which was prevented by La Cosa, he got them to agree that the middle of the Gulf of Uraba should be the dividing line. The 2 governors set sail for Tierra Firme, Nuquesa departing last on account of difficulties with his creditors. And just so the audience understands, the boundary dispute, this was settled by the Royal Cedula of 1510, in which it was provided that the Gulf of Uraba belonged to the dominion of Ojeda. Just want to make that clear. Continuing on, in November 1509, Ojeda arrived with his men near the audience of Quirego, which encloses the Bay of Cartagena, so called because of its likeness to the port of Cartagena in Spain. Among the expeditionists was Francisco Pizarro, and the famous Hernan Cortez could not come along because of an injured knee which kept him in Santo Domingo. Juan de la Cosa, who knew the coast, advised Ojeda to abandon it and chose the Gulf of Uraba, where the Indians were less fierce and did not use poisoned arrows. But the pride of the chief would not give way before naked enemies, and 2 days later a landing was made at Cartagena with the larger part of the forces and several friars who had come to undertake their evangelical mission. The arrogant conquistador advanced towards the savages, who were on the defensive, and ordered a singular manifesto to be read to them in a high voice. This proclamation is very important because it was the model adopted by future conquerors and gives a graphic picture of the spirit of the epoch. The document, which was written in Spain, said in substance that the 2 governors on landing should announce to the natives the principal articles of the Christian faith, inform them especially of the supreme jurisdiction of the Pope over all the kingdoms of the earth, to the end that he might be obeyed, notified them of concession that Alexander had made of these regions to the King of Spain, and required them to embrace the Catholic region and submit to the Spanish monarch. Finally, if they refused to accept these terms, they were to be threatened as follows. Quote, I will employ my power against you, and make war upon you, in all ways and places that I am able to, and will subject you to the yoke and obedience of the church and his majesty, and will take your women and children and make them slaves, and as such sell them and dispose of them as his majesty may order, and I will seize your property and do you all the damage and evil that I can as vassals who do not obey or wish to receive their lord and who resist and oppose him. End quote. The document having been read, Ojeda made peaceful signs to the Indians, showing them presents in order to attract them. But the natives, naturally not having understood and already on guard, brandished their arms, sounded their horns, and advanced for battle. The Indians were repulsed, many being killed and others made prisoners. Inspirited by success, Ojeda decided to proceed through the forest of Turbaco. The natives had taken refuge in the woods with their families and valuables, and the Spaniards, believing them totally vanquished, spread around the dwellings in search for booty, whereupon the Indians seized an opportunity to make a counterattack, and a horde of them fell upon the Spaniards. Under such conditions, all resistance was useless. After heroic efforts, Ojeda was able to escape, but the valiant La Cosa perished upon the field. After the daring conqueror had suffered the greatest hardships while fleeing almost dead through the tropical jungle, he managed to reach the coast, where he joined those of his followers who had stayed with the ships. At this precarious moment, Nicuessa arrived and, forgetting all former enmities, treated Ojeda as a brother. United, the two governors took cruel revenge upon the Indians, entering the town at night and laying it waste with little regard for the age or sex of the inhabitants. Nicuessa then proceeded westward. Alonso de Ojeda, disheartened by the resistance of the Torbacos, gave up the idea of colonizing the coast of Cartagena. He made his way to the Gulf of Uraba, stopping at Fuerte Island, where he enslaved all the inhabitants he could seize and deprived them of their valuables. I just want to chime in really quickly here. Alonso de Ojeda. I highly recommend watching the series from Spain called Conquistadors Adventum. And what's really interesting about our friend Alonso de Ojeda is this guy was very, very like one of the first people to see so many different places. I mean, this is a guy that traveled through Guyana, Venezuela, Trinidad, Tobago, Curacao, Aruba, Colombia. He did all of this long before anyone viewed these places as countries, if that makes sense. But I just want to make that clear. You're going to see a situation where there are a lot of people that sort of have appeared in other parts of Latin America, if that makes sense. So, for example, on the topic of Gonzalo Jimenez de Quesada, this was a man who, he would also become the first mayor of Bogota, and he would found the city of Bogota. And you guys are going to find out later why it was called Bogota. And yeah, what's interesting as well is that he actually is, if I recall correctly here, I believe he is a distant cousin of both Pizarro and Cortez, which is an interesting coincidence. But yeah, you have a lot of important people from Andalusia at this point in time after the Reconquista playing a huge role in essentially conquering all of Latin America. All right, so continuing on. But omitted the reading of the manifesto, perhaps on account of the exigencies of the situation. On the eastern part of the Gulf, on the slope of some hills, he selected a site and in a short time erected a stockade and built 30 thatched huts. This settlement, the first to be founded on Colombian territory by the Spaniards, received the name of San Sebastián de Uraba in honor of the Christian martyr of that name who had died of arrow wounds and whom the settlers implored to defend them from the poisoned arrows of the Indians. The needs of the settlers augmented daily, and as the provisions diminished, the hostility of the natives increased. To such extreme were the Spaniards reduced that they forgot the gold and thought only of food, for hunger devoured them in the very midst of the luxuriant vegetation. Their terror increased their needs, and the sight of dead companions killed by poisoned arrows was ever present. In order to strike a decisive blow, the Indians prepared an ambush for Ojeda, who was wounded in the thigh with a poisoned arrow, but was saved by his valor and energy, for he made his followers apply red-hot irons to the fresh wound. Failing to receive the expected resources from his associate Fernandez de Encisco, he was left in Santo Domingo to get them ready. Ojeda felt obliged, with his followers' consent, to go in person to Española for the needed supplies. After having promised to return within 50 days. During his absence, Francisco Pizarro was left in command with instructions to the effect that, if the governor did not return within a certain period, the settlers should abandon San Sebastian. And then it says here the chief of the colony never returned. 2 months after Ojeda's departure, Pizarro decided to abandon the colony and set sail for Santo Domingo, which he did in 2 vessels. One of these was lost within sight of the other, which was unable to save any of the crew. Near Cartagena, Pizarro met Fernandez de Enciso, who was at last arriving with the reinforcements promised to Ojeda. Enciso compelled Pizarro and his companions to turn back, and during the voyage they touched on the coasts of Sinu, whose riches they had heard in Cartagena. Fernandez de Enciso decided to make a trip to the Sinu River in search of the treasures said to be buried in the tombs of the natives, but it seems the excursion was not successful. Nevertheless, the explorers had an encounter with the natives. Before the combat, Fernandez de Enciso caused the well-known manifesto to be read to the Indians, and on this occasion the hearers understood through an interpreter. At least Fernandez de Enciso says so in his Summa de Geografia, which was published in Seville in 1519. He declares they answered that, quote, what he said about one God who governed heaven and earth was Lord of all might be so, but the king who asked and took such a gift must have been somewhat crazy, since he asked for what belonged to someone else, end quote. Arriving at San Sebastian, Fernandez de Enciso lost the largest of his ships near the port, together with the animals and seeds on board. The village he found harassed by the natives, and after trying to enter from the land side, he decided, following Balboa's experienced advice, to abandon the place for good. About 35, so this is, just so the audience understands here, this is describing Balboa. About 35 years of age, tall and well-built, strong and handsome, with the gentle manners of a scholar, but capable of great effort, a very pleasant disposition and attractive figure. Thus appears Vasco Núñez de Balboa among the adventurers who at that time sailed the Sea of Darkness, thirsting for American gold. You already know that this conqueror came with Rodrigo de Bastidas as an ordinary member of the crew on the first voyage of the explorer. After that excursion along the Colombian coast, we lost sight of him only to find him again in Santo Domingo, cultivating a farm near the seashore in the town of Salvatierra de la Sabana. His agricultural enterprises did not prosper, and very soon involved in debt, he was seen mixing with the rabble of insolvent debtors who then seethed on the island. When Fernandez de Enciso was preparing to set sail from Santo Domingo, many of the vagabonds and debtors sought to embark with him, but were prevented by their creditors. Balboa, wiser and bolder, with the help of his friend Bartolomeu Hurtado, who hid him in the folds of a sail of one of the ships, eluded the vigilance of his enemies and managed to embark. Quote, he came on board without more capital than his sword and no companion save his dog, end quote. Such was the man who persuaded the lawyer Fernandez de Enciso to transfer his settlement to the west side of the Gulf of Uraba near the Atrado, a territory whose advantages he knew. Enciso set sail and reached the neighborhood of the Darien River, where there was a town of considerable size. The Spaniards landed and in battle array marched along the bank. The region was under the Caciquisemaco, who took the families of the natives to a safe place and came to the defense of the town. Fearing the poisoned arrows, the soldiers carried wooden shields. They attacked the enemy with courage, and after a vigorous resistance, the Spaniards entered the town, which they pillaged. The booty was available: gold, foods, among others, cacao, cotton clothes used by the women, and vessels and utensils of clay and wood. Satisfied with their triumph, they established the town of Santa Maria de la Antigua de del Darien, which was in 1510. The conquerors were getting ready for new expeditions when discord began to permeate the ranks because Fernandez de Incisco, on his authority as Alcalde Mayor, had given an order prohibiting the gold trade with the Indians and providing that the penalty for such trade should be death. The soldiers would not stand for such harsh measures, for they had come in search of gold. With the murmurs, dissatisfaction increased, and this was taken advantage of by Balboa, who was already admired by his companions and looked upon as the one who had saved them from the disasters of San Sebastian. Balboa did not like Fernandez de Incisco and sent about to displace him, calling him a usurper because he was exercising authority outside of his jurisdiction. The dividing line between the two grants was the Gulf, and as the town was to the west of this body of water, it was on Nicuessa's territory. Although there was a great diversity of opinions, some desiring to recognize Nicuessa, others to abide by Fernandez de Incisco's authority, and the majority being in favor of Balboa. Fernandez de Incisco was deprived of his authority, and the conspirators organized a civil government at the head of which were placed Balboa and Martin de Zamudio as alcaldes. These arrangements did not put an end to the dissensions, which would have grown worse had it not been for the arrival of Rodrigo Colmenares, who generously distributed provisions among the hungry Spaniards and, with their consent, went with other commissioners in search of Nicuessa, who was recognized by the lawful governor. The unfortunate Nicuessa, after he left Ojeda in Cartagena, proceeded to explore the coast of Isthmus, where he suffered great hardships. The commissioners found Diego de Nuesca, who accepted the invitation to be governor and offered some of them important positions in the colony of Antigua, as substitutes for Balboa and others. Balboa and his followers received news of these arrangements, for Nicuessa allowed some of the men to come ahead of him to Antigua. This lack of foresight was the cause of Diego de... So I'm going to stop here for this part of the book, and I'm going to just resume the chapter 2. We're only going to be reading select portions of this book, because the vast majority of this book is not actually about the conquest. It's just about Colombia in general. And I'm not trying to do that today. So I wanted to do something in terms of creating a introduction for Ojeda. So let's continue on, and this is called The Founding of Santa Marta and Cartagena. So we're talking about the port of Colombia, more from the north side, I believe. So Santa Marta, on a beautiful harbor known as the Pearl of America, is situated the city of Santa Maria. It is the capital of the department of Magdalena, where the... Also, I don't know why I said Santa Maria. It's definitely Santa Marta. I don't want to confuse anyone there. Continuing. Liberator of 5 nations passed away. This city, and just so you guys know, I believe that's a reference to Simón Bolívar. This city, so full of historical memories, was founded by Rodrigo de Bastidas on our Atlantic coast in 1525. The Spanish government seriously contemplated the occupation of the newly discovered continent because it was afraid of the attempts of other countries. In 1524, it signed a capitulation with Bastidas to settle the province and port of Santa Marta, leaving to the judgment of the conqueror the choice of the place of settlement within the region between Cabo de la Vela and the mouths of the Ceniza of Magdalena. Among other conditions, he agreed to take with him 50 men, some of them married, for a formal establishment was being considered. The tract granted to the Bastidas covered a front of 80 leagues on the coast without any definite limits in the unknown interior. We shall see how this settlement was important as a base for explorations which penetrated to the lands of the Chibcha nation. In 1525, Bastidas, who was then living in Santo Domingo, left that island with 3 ships and in February reached an inlet near Gaira. The bay was already, since 1501, known as Santa Marta, and the same name was given to the city founded by Bastidas. With the governor came Pedro Villafuerte as Lieutenant General, Rodrigo Alvarez Palomino, Juan de Ledesma, royal accountant, and, among others, the Portuguese captain Antonio Diaz de Cordoso and Juan de San Martin. True to his principles, Bastidas made peace with the Gairas, Taganas, and Dorsinos, who were neighboring tribes, and obtained some gold in an expedition to the lands of the Bondas and Bondinguas. He kept his troops busy cutting and transporting timber for making houses. He did not tolerate any maltreatment of the Aborigines, which explains his alliances with the tribes that had been hostile to others who had treated them in a different manner. The hard work to which he put the Spaniards, who were being used to being served by the natives as beasts of burden, and the prohibition of the gold trade with Indians gave motive for a conspiracy against the life of the governor. Moreover, food was scarce and disease was prevalent among the colonists. The night Villafuerte decided to kill Bastidas, the latter had retired. One of the conspirators came into his room, attacking him and inflicting some wounds. But several men, aroused by the noise, came to his defense, and the assassins fled. Shortly afterward, the governor appointed Palomino as lieutenant general and left for Santo Domingo in quest of health. Unfavorable winds took him to Santiago de Cuba, where he died in 1526. His son, then dean of the Cathedral of Santo Domingo, had his father's remains taken to the cathedral. Quote, "The conduct of this conqueror," unquote, says an account by Aristides Rojas, quote, "appears in the early history of the American continent as that of a noble, worthy, and humane soul. He was not stained by the acts of greed or barbarism, nor did he violate the principles of humanity," end quote. The authors of the attack upon Bastidas took refuge in the forests, but in the end, Villafuerte and Pedro de Porras were captured and taken to Santo Domingo, where they were executed. The new chief, Palomino, followed the same peaceful policy with the neighboring tribes, but allowed his followers to raid others farther away, such as the Zacas and Cheramas. The royal audiencia of Santo Domingo at the death of Bastidas appointed Pedro Badillo as temporary governor of Santa Marta. He brought Pedro de Heredia along his lieutenant. Palomino would not give up his post, however, asserting that he was Bastidas' lieutenant, and he supported his claim by his arms, for Badillo had fewer troops. Badillo, observing that he was not able to resist his rival, abandoned the post. His lieutenant, Heredia, had arranged with a certain Captain Baez a plan to take the city and kill Palomino, but the latter, having been duly warned, had the captain hung. Badillo preferred not to return to Santo Domingo, but to proceed along the coast and fortify himself in the Bay of Concha. Palomino set out to attack him, but the mediation of the chaplains of the troops prevented the encounter, and the two leaders came to an understanding, united their forces, and shared the command until a decision could be had from the crown. The leaders conducted a raid to the land of the Taronas, whose chief town was Posigueca, but without results. The coast of Ramada was then thickly populated, having important towns, and thither the two conquerors went in search of booty. And it says, while crossing river, Palomino met his death. Badillo, now free from his rival, gave vent to his passions, and the natives became the victims of Spanish depredations. The towns of the Ramada having been devastated, he proceeded to the Dupar Valley, which he occupied for many months, returning to Santa Marta loaded with gold and accompanied by many slaves. As he suspected his term of office would be short, he decided to take revenge upon Palomino's friends. Some of them he tortured, others he scourged. Emperor Charles V filled the vacancy in the government by the appointment in 1528 of Garcia de Lerma, a gentleman from Burgos, an illustrious and learned man, but more fit for a civil government than for the military command at Santa Marta. He was given wise instructions, humane procedure with the natives, was him not only not permitting their enslavement, but returning home all those sold as such. The increase of the European population, and the encouragement of mechanical arts and agriculture. The royal order also forbade the slave trade on the islands, and in order to protect the savages, the Dominican Fray Tomas Ortiz was appointed. He was to come over with the governor and aid him in the fulfillment of his humanitarian duties. Lerma contracted for the colony some Portuguese farmers who brought with them the seeds of cereals, of fruit trees, and of vegetables, and also dispatched several artisans such as bricklayers, blacksmiths, carpenters. In order to bring Badillo to account, Lerma sent a lawyer ahead who arrested and tortured him in order to discover and obtain the royal share which had been appropriated. The case was prosecuted so vigorously that if Lerma had not arrived, the criminal would have perished on the gallows. Badillo was sent to Spain, but he died on the way, for the ship was wrecked on the Spanish coast at Arenas Gordas. Lerma arrived in Santa Marta in 1529, and the appearance of the straw huts in which he was to live with his companions was so desolate that he ordered the first masonry house to be built. With the governor came his relatives Juan and Pedro de Lerma, Juan Munoz de Colantes, others less notable, and 400 men. Owing to the scarcity of food, Lerma made a survey of the land. He also ordered a search for gold mines in the Ramada, and he afterward visited the large towns of Bosingua and Alaringua before returning to the capital. All the tribes revealed a peaceful disposition and gave aid to the Spaniards. Circumstances were opportune for the civilization of the region. Yet Lerma did not take advantage of them. He appointed instead a commission of 3 senior captains to distribute the Indians among the settlers. The object of the distribution was to determine the number of Indians who should pay tribute to each encomendero. The tribute consisted of the amount of gold dust required to fill the quill of a bird's feather. A part of the troops was sent afterward to the Dupar Valley under the command of Pedro de Lerma, nephew of the governor, in order to proceed with the exploration of the region. This important expedition descended the Cesar River to Tamalameque, and from this point Captains Berrio and Lebrija reached, by the way of Magdalena, a river which they called Lebrija. Another partly left the city in company with Fray Tomas Ortiz, who already had been appointed first bishop of Santa Marta. Ortiz proposed to catechize the natives who were to meet at that time near the Cienaga, where a fair was being held. The last years of his government show only a guilty weakness on the part of Garcia de Lerma. He failed to use a strong hand to prevent abuses by the Spaniards, who were annihilating the Indian population. Old age and disease prevented him from taking personal command of the troops, and he finally died in Santa Marta in 1532, poor and without having accomplished anything of importance. Besides the explorations of Captains Berrio and Lebrija, already mentioned, there are 2 more of special importance because they opened the trail that was to be followed years later by the most noted of the conquerors of the country of Colombia, Jimenez de Quesada. The Portuguese knight, Geronimo Melo, arrived at Santa Marta about the year 1529 and offered to ascend the Magdalena, whose waters no one had navigated before. He had to use force to compel the pilots to go up the river, which he ascended as far as Malambo. No practical results were derived from this expedition. The Portuguese knight returned to the capital and asked the governor to send another expedition by land with enough men to visit the towns on both sides of the Magdalena. But the sudden death of Melo, caused by grief arising from the death of his brother at the hands of the Indians, prevented the execution of the project. The second enterprise was motivated by eagerness for new adventures, for the monotony of life in the colony under Lerma could not enervate the temper of the vigorous characters of the time. From captains like Cespedes, Cardoso, Muñoz, Manjares, Juan de San Martin, and others, it was difficult to pick out a chief without offending the rest, and for this reason, Diego Viana, a cleric, was appointed. He left by land with about 100 soldiers and some pilots who came with Melo, were to ascend the Magdalena on boats to help the infantry cross the river where necessary. Viana traversed the land of the Chimilas, reached the Magdalena, and died while waiting for the boats. The expedition was on the point of breaking up, but owing to the influence of its more courageous members, the explorers continued along the left bank of the river after many difficulties reached the junction of the Cauca and the Magdalena. They then followed the Cauca to its junction with the San Jorge, and proceeding along the left bank of the Cauca, continued their expedition. After 8 months of useless efforts, the Spaniards returned to Santa Marta at the beginning of the year 1532. Don Rodrigo Infante, Odor of the Audiencia of Santo Domingo, was then governor. So now we're going to move on here to Cartagena. Beautiful city, which I have been in, highly recommend. This illustrious and heroic city, capital of the Department of Bolivar, was founded in 1533 by Don Pedro de Heredia, a native of Madrid. The month and day of its foundation is a matter of controversy. Many historians give January 21st, others January 20th, and still others June 1st of the same year. Heredia was one of those captains who most distinguished themselves in the exploration and conquest of the country. A practical Indian fighter, and possessed of great valor and firmness, he knew how to command obedience. A swordsman and swashbuckler in his youth, he had his nose mutilated during a fight, but had taken revenge by killing some of his opponents. For this, he had to flee to Santo Domingo, where he later inherited a comfortable position and some rural property. About this time, Badillo appointed him as his lieutenant and brought him to Santa Marta. He returned afterward to Spain with the riches obtained in the Dupar Valley and entered into a contract with the crown for the conquest and settlement of the coast of Tierra Firme from the mouths of the Magdalena to the Atrado River. Among the distinguished persons who came with Heredia was his second-in-command, Francisco Cesar. A notable character, the governor had experience in America, and in the equipment of the expedition was reduced strictly to necessities. He brought furniture and utensils, great quantities of arms, and a considerable amount of articles as bells, red caps, mirrors, and other trifles known as rescades, which were used to secure the gold and other valuable objects of the Indians when force was not employed. Moreover, remembering the poisoned arrows of the natives, he equipped his soldiers with special horn armor. In 1533, he anchored in the port known as Calamari. After a fight with the Torbacos, the new governor decided to found a city in this port. The preliminary arrangements were made and the settlement was called Cartagena. Once established, Heredia made friends with Sarex, an Indian chief of the Isle of Codego, and with Duhoa, a chief of that of Baru. He made a raid into the interior without mishap and went as far as Malambo, where he returned to Cartagena with a booty worth about 500,000 gold ducats. So for you guys just listening here, I want you to understand, a gold ducat was a coin used in Spain until about the end of the 16th century. This would be worth about 7 pesetas. Continuing on. The Pacific entrance of the conquerors into Sipagua is worth noting. The chief received Heredia with great manifestation of peace. The camp was visited by beautiful Indian girls. In a temple of the town, the Spaniards found a figure of solid gold made to represent a porcupine and weighing about 140 pounds. This very valuable image was taken away from the temple as an idolatrous thing, though perhaps greed had far more to do with this action. The product of this incursion was therefore valuable, each soldier receiving about 6,000 ducats, a larger fortune than that obtained by the soldier conquerors of Mexico or Peru. Again, the governor left Cartagena with the view of... Alright, so I want to pause that real quickly and make a few things clear regarding the difference, another difference between what you would think of the conquest of Colombia. Now, what's really interesting is this was actually one of the most pound for pound profitable conquests out of the entirety of Latin America. The amount of gold and emerald and other such resources that the Spaniards were able to get in what is now Colombia, uh, it was insane. It was ridiculous. There's a reason why the story of El Dorado would originate in this land. Um, so yeah, you had a situation where essentially it was extremely profitable, even though definitely Mexico had a lot more land in in comparison. But it's also important to understand as well that there's so regarding the actual conquerors. For example, if we talk about Gonzalo Jimenez de Quesada, this was a very unseasoned and inexperienced newcomer when he came over to do this conquest. And of the 93 veterans of the expedition, of whom we have any data on, basically a handful had previous military experience in other parts of Europe, but 63% of Jimenez's men practically had no experience in the slightest. This was very different as opposed to Peru, where a lot of these people were battle hardened from other battles, especially like in Central America, to my knowledge. It's also important to say as well that the median age of the men of New Granada, this was around 23. So these are very inexperienced people, very youthful Spaniards in comparison. You had Hernan Cortez, for example, who was middle-aged in Mexico whenever he did his conquest. And you had a situation as well where most of the veterans of the Jimenez expedition, they lived a fairly long life, which was weird. So among Jimenez's men, the median age for death was 63 years old, which is very, very impressive for the 16th century, and especially among conquistadors. No fewer than 42 veterans of the expeditions lived beyond the age of 65, and half of those lived well into the 70s or early 80s. For reasons not yet fully understood, the conquistadors of Granada enjoyed far longer lives than their counterparts in Peru. And this is important. So let's continue on here. And soon, actually, we're going to delve into the Germans, who played a very significant role in the conquest of Colombia as well. We're going to go into very much detail how the dynamics played out, why there were Germans there, and I think you guys will like it quite a bit. Reaching the South Sea and explored the Sinu. On a vast plain where deer were hunted lived the chief Finzenu, a woman who received Heredia on a friendly matter. There, the Spaniards saw the general cemetery of the neighborhood filled with countless earthen mounds of unequal height, some conical, others square, some were hidden in the underbrush, some under great cebas that revealed ages of growth. The size of the mound indicated the fortune of the family of the dead person buried therein, because after the burial, the relatives and friends began a drinking contest. And as long as the liquor lasted, the earth continued to accumulate on the grave. Among the mounds was one distinguishable at a distance of over a league, and the Spaniards, judging it by its size, called it the Devil's Tomb. Many mounds were excavated and gold objects representing persons and animals were found. Decimated by hunger and the climate, the Spaniards returned to Cartagena, so ill and with faces so wan that they appeared to have taken out of the graves of which they talked so incessantly. The prudent historian Acosta adds that the rewards of this toilsome journey, with which each Spaniard might have returned home and lived for the rest of his days, were squandered in feathers, silks, and other luxuries, or lost at the gambling table. In Cartagena, the Adelantando met Fray Tomás de Toro, first Bishop of Cartagena, and Don Alonso de Heredia, his older brother, whom he appointed lieutenant general, thus depriving the distinguished Francisco Cesar of this title. In this captivity, Don Alonso made 2 expeditions to the Sinu in different years, reaching the Cauca River in the second one, 1535, after having visited the town of Ayapo. In 1536, the governor undertook from the coast of Darien an expedition lasting 3 months along the right of the bank of Atrato, but without achieving any success. In the same year, and because of grave charges presented to the court against the Heredia brothers, the Audiencia of Santo Domingo appointed Juan de Badillo to proceed to Cartagena in order to take the place of the officer who had died on his way from Spain. He was instructed to bring the Heredias to account for defrauding the royal treasury and maltreating and enslaving the Indians. He found the accusations true and forthwith imprisoned the culprits. Once in jail, loaded with chains, the victims had few friends, but Francisco Cesar, revealing his magnanimity, loaned Don Pedro money from which to pay for his defense before the court which he was to be tried. In Spain, he was finally acquitted, and he returned years afterward to the colony with all his titles and prerogatives. Vadillo found the infant city of Cartagena prosperous, doubtless owing to the larger amounts of gold obtained in the raids, the abundance of food, and the pacification of neighboring tribes, and especially because of its location on the most frequented point of the coast. Ships often touched at this beautiful port. Commodious houses were being built, and at least one of its barrios was very clean. Now we're on to another part of the conquest, which is something that is very, very unknown by most people in history, and I'm glad that you're listening now. So this is actually, there's a unique part of the Conquest of Colombia that takes place subsequently after what I'm reading about occurred, and it's regarding the Germans, who played a very important role in this situation as well. Many of you might be thinking, what? Why are Germans doing this, right? Well, just listen, and we're going to continue here. So it says here, 2 Germans, Henry Alfinger and Jerome Saylor, proposed to the Spanish crown to equip at their own cost a fleet of 4 or more ships, with not less than 200 armed men, for the purpose of pacifying the region of Santa Marta. They also pointed out that near this region was another, extending from Cabo de la Vela to Maracapana, which is Venezuela, and offered to conquer and settle it without receiving any other compensation than that which should be fixed by a special agreement between them. At the beginning of 1528, the pact was signed. It was an authorization of conquest with these provisions. The contracting parties were to send a fleet equipped at their expense, and they were given permission themselves or through their agents Ambrose and George Alfinger, Henry's brothers, to conquer and settle the provinces extending from Cabo de la Vela to the boundary of the government of Santa Marta to Maracapana. They were to found 2 towns and build 3 forts. One of the concessionaires was to receive the title of governor and captain general for life, and the other that of the adelantado. In October of the same year, the grantees delegated their powers to Ambrose Ehinger, or Alfinger, who received the respective appointment from the crown. In 1530, the grantees asked Charles V to transfer their rights to the brothers Anthony and Bartholomew Wessler, famous Augsburg bankers, which favor was granted by a capitulation identical with the first one. Alfinger thus came to be a representative of the German bankers. And I want to make something clear for everybody that's listening here as well. Several Venezuelan historians claim that Charles V made this grant because he was in debt to the Welsers. This view is supported by Antonio de Herrera and Fray Bartolomeo de las Casas. Just wanted to make that clear here, because you might be thinking, like, why are Germans here? Well, that's why. Ambrose Alfinger landed in Coro, Venezuela in 1529 with 780 men, among whom were Germans, Spaniards, Portuguese, and black slaves from New Guinea. He took possession of the territory and, driven by an insatiable thirst for gold, soon began his explorations. The Spanish chroniclers call Alfinger the cruel of cruels, and the more recent German writers have accepted this statement. In November 1531, he left Maracaibo, a town founded by him, with about 300 men and many Indians who carried provisions and baggage. Penetrating into our territory, he made his way to the Dupar Valley. The conqueror left a trail of robbery, assassination, and arson, and subjected the Indian carriers to the most inhumane treatment. According to Las Casas, the latter proceeded naked, tied together with iron rings around their necks, each carrying from 75 to 100 pounds. When one of the natives became exhausted, his head was cut off. In order to avoid severing the iron chain, and his load was distributed among the others. From the Dupar Valley, the German continued his journey to the Cesar River, at its confluence with the Magdalena. The Indians, who had heard of his cruelties, fled with their canoes to prevent his crossing the stream, but Alfinger, whom nothing daunted, ordered his soldiers to wade through, offering as a prize the jewels and gold which could be seen shining on the bodies of the Indians. The Indians were surprised and could offer no serious resistance. Some were sacrificed in the fight, others, among whom was the chief Tamalamek, who were made prisoners. In the hope of finding richer lands led Alfinger to send Captain Inigo de Vasconia with the booty captured to Coro, in order to buy horses and arms and recruit men. After waiting patiently for his envoy, the conqueror decided to return by another route. From Tamalameque, he followed the banks of the Magdalena, climbed the sierras of Ocaña in search of a better climate, and arrived at the Giron Valley. He then crossed the eastern Paramos by the way of High Cordillera of Cachiri, descended to the town of Silos, department of Santander del Norte, and afterwards made his way to the valley of Chinacota in the same department. While making examinations of that valley, Alfinger was attacked by the Indians and received in the neck a deep wound from a poisoned arrow, from which he died of 4 days later. He was buried at the foot of a tree of which an epitaph was carved. The valley was given the name, quote, Mr. Ambrosio, end quote. This chief being dead, his companions chose Pedro de San Martin in his place. The new leader conducted back to Coro whither they returned through the valleys of Cucuta. By recommendation of the Welsers, the court appointed George Hauermuth in 1534 of Speyer, a city in Moravia, as governor. The Spaniards called him Jorge de Spira, the name which he signed his letters. Spira, greedy but honest, was a good general, well liked by his followers and not cruel. He left Coro in search of El Dorado in 1535, descended the Merida Sierra, and appeared on the eastern plains of Apure and Casanare. The rainy season detained him here for several months, after which he continued his journey southward amidst savage tribes. He crossed the rivers Apure and Araqua, confronted all kinds of obstacles, and tried to traverse the high Cordillera in order to reach the rich lands of the Chibchas towards the west. Now, just so the audience is listening and understands, the Chibchas, or the Muiscas, these were the most advanced Indians in Colombia. These are, in fact, I even have a Muisca last name myself. I descend from those people on the Indian side of my family, which I believe, according to the DNA test I took, is about a quarter of my DNA. But again, DNA is not the same as your actual genealogy. It's important to understand that. Continuing on, I was going to say, as we get closer, and we're eventually going to reach a point where they're going to stumble onto the Muiscas, which is where this stream, if you've been paying attention, it's going to pick up quite a bit in comparison to everything that we've been going over so far. But the context leading up to that is extremely crucial, and it's something that I don't think would really be right if we didn't include it in the video. So once we get to the point where we find the Muiscas, I encourage people in the audience, if they have questions about the Muiscas, maybe about their way of life, their culture, etc., just feel free to pop in and ask in the comment section, and I'll try to answer it to the best of my ability. So yeah, continuing here. The march was continued along the foot of the Andes until he reached the territory of the Guayapis, who were inhabiting the upper region of the Meta River. These, according to the Spaniards, were the most cruel and warlike Indians in America. The journey lasted for about a year, and the troops, decimated by hardships, now marching up the Andes and now resolutely southward toward the equator. During one of the dull nights of the plains, the explorers were awakened by the noise of the Indians, who struck the trees and the ground with their arms as if they were in a fury. Their action was caused by an eclipse of the moon, for the Indians considered this to be a sign of approaching calamities. Spira afterward reached and crossed the Guaviare River. The land beyond was dominated by the Chogus, cannibals who used for lances sharpened human skins tied to sticks. They represented the sun as a human figure on their shields and ate all kinds of animals, even worms. Spira advanced a little further south, but complete lack of supplies, disease among his men, and the death of his best captains compelled him to turn back towards Coro, which he reached in 1538, with 110 men out of over 400 with whom he had started. Hohermuth, refusing to learn from experience, desired to make another journey to the lands visited by him, but he died of fever in Coro near the end of the year in 1540. The most celebrated of the Germans who explored for the Welsers was Nicholas Featherman, a brave and wise soldier and a young, intelligent, and ambitious native of the city of Ulm in the old kingdom of Württemberg. It's important for the reader to understand again, Germany is not a unified nation state at this given time. It is a million little city-states, some of whom are part of the Holy Roman Empire, some of whom are not, if I recall correctly. Continuing on, distinguished as a strategist, he knew how to win the goodwill of all who he met. Featherman had a red beard and was tall, robust, and agile. He had been appointed to replace Alfinger, but the next year, before taking possession of his post, he was succeeded by Spira. It should be remembered that Fetterman had been in Venezuela before, with an expedition from Coro to the interior by way of Barquisimeto, Anarue, El Bao, and San Felipe, concerning which he wrote an interesting narrative. Early in 1535, Spira and Fetterman were found at Coro as rivals in a government which had been conferred upon both in a rapid succession. Instead of starting an argument over the command, they agreed to divide the men in Coro and to go each on his own account in search of gold. They began their excursions almost at the same time. After due preparations, Fetterman proceeded with some 200 men, perhaps by way of Maracaibo to Cabo de Vella. Then, turning back and advancing inland by Barquisimeto, he continued southward and appeared on the plains of Colombia. Fleeing from the rainy season, he approached the Cordillera, and coming back from the sabanas after the flood had receded, reached the upper Meta, where he heard of the Guigas, wandering Indians of the Pampas who robbed and pillaged as they went. He established himself in the location called Nuestra Señora de la Fragua, where we shall leave him for the present. The name of another German governor who succeeded Spira, Philip Hutin, should not be omitted. His character contrasted singularly with that of the ruthless conquerors of the time. A loyal and unselfish youth of affable character and a romantic adventurer with a vivid imagination. He had gone with Spira on the hazardous journey already described. It appears that Hutin took charge of the government at Coro at 1541, and in August of the same year left on an expedition with 150 men destined to a tragic end. Following the trail of Fetterman, Hutin wandered for more than 4 years, reaching the upper Guaviare, near the territory inhabited by the Chogus. The victim of the treachery of his guide, Pedro de Limpias, he returned gold and was assassinated to Cuyo by the intruding governor Juan de Carvajal in 1546. With the death of Hutin, the Welser domination in Venezuela began to decline. Notwithstanding their long efforts, in 1556 it was decided by the Council of the Indies that they had not lived up to their contract with the court and had therefore lost their rights in Venezuela. Pedro de Heredia, the founder of Cartagena, arrived in Puerto Rico in 1532. Among his men, as already noted, was Francisco Cesar, who had been one of the companions of Sebastian Cabot on his voyage to the River Plate. The governor of Cartagena had named Caesar his lieutenant, and in an adventure with the bellicose Turbacos, he almost perished on account of his daring. He was saved only by his armor, which the poisoned arrows of the Indians failed to penetrate. Caesar had lost his post with Alonso de Heredia, already mentioned, arrived at Cartagena, but the latter eventually appointed him second in command and commissioned him at Sinu to go to the coast for provisions. Captain Caesar found in Tolu the object of his quest and also 10,000 castellanos of gold which the Indians presented to him. Heredia, knowing of the riches obtained by the captain, asked him for them under the pretext of paying the expenses of fitting out a ship which he had brought supplies for the colony. Caesar, declaring that he had to distribute the treasure among his companions, refused to turn it over to him. Upon his return to Sinu, he was loaded with chains and condemned to die. However, there was no one who would dare to execute the sentence, and the victim continued for a while in chains like a criminal. The noble spirit of Caesar responded to such treatment by offering help when the Heredias were in disgrace. To atone for all his sufferings, fortune had reserved for him the discovery of the rich lands of Antiquia. In 1537, Pedro de Heredia granted Caesar permission to go with some followers in search of the famed treasure of Dadadayabe, nor was he discouraged by Heredia's failure in connection with this enterprise. At the time now under consideration, Caesar was found in San Sebastián de Buenavista, a village which had been established near the old site of San Sebastián de Uraba. From here, he undertook his journey with 100 picked men and several horses, intending to cross the Abibe Sierra, which is one of the western branches of the Andes, very rough, covered with forests, and with no trail except that marked by the torrents which rush down from the heights to the sea on one side and to the Cauca River on the other. From the Gulf of Darien to the village of Chief Abibe, this land is swampy for several leagues. The conquerors on this account were almost lost before they reached Abibe. From there on, the difficulties were less, although many soldiers died. Caesar descended to the neat valley of the Guaca, situated on the slope of the Abibe Sierra toward the Cauca River, and reached the first town at the termination of the mountains, the inhabitants offering zero resistance. The Valley of Guaca was one of the most populated and best cultivated regions of the territory of Antiquia. In it, there were larger houses surrounded by fruit trees. The noted chronicler and soldier Pedro de Cieza de Leon lists among the trees not only guavas, aguacates, and pineapples, but also many kinds of palms. The natives, who dressed in cotton robes, were rich and industrious and had great respect for their chief. Atibara, or Nutibara, the lord of the country, decided, when he heard of the invaders, to defend his territory. The encounter was bloody, and the victory of the Spaniards was due to Caesar's action in killing Quinunucho, a brother of the chief, for the Indians abandoned the field, carrying away the body of the dead warrior. An old Indian squaw remained on the bloody field. She was threatened with cruel punishment if she did not reveal the place where the treasures were hidden. It says here, quote, the frightened squaw led them through the woods for a distance of about 3 leagues to a place where underneath was less dense and pointed to a large tombstone, which was promptly removed. Underneath it, the Spaniards found gold worth 100,000 pesos, end quote. Knowing that Nutibara was assembling his whole army to march against him, Caesar hurried out of the region and in 17 days was in San Sebastián. Sebastián de Belalcázar was one of the prominent figures of the conquest, was born probably between 1478 and 1480. In the village whose name he bears, between Extremadura and Andalusia, Spain, his family name was Moyano, and his parents of humble origin worked their own small farm. Columbus was getting ready in Seville for his 3rd voyage when the young man made his way to that city and, with many others, applied for and obtained passage with the idea of settling in Santo Domingo. Belalcázar served in the ranks during the conquest of this island, distinguishing himself and becoming an experienced captain. But Santo Domingo was too large of a stage for his ambitions, and he went to Darien to serve under Balboa in the exploration of the Pacific coast. Here he made friends with the future conquerors of Peru, Pizarro and Almagro, Sucro. Under the orders of Pedradias, he accompanied Francisco Fernandez de Cordoba in the expedition to Nicaragua, and as a result for his merits, secured the appointment as alcalde of the city of León, just founded. Returning to Panama, he enlisted in the expedition fitted out by his friends for the conquest of Peru. In the land of the Incas, he rendered valuable services and later had the honor of being the founder of Quito, capital of the Republic of Ecuador. Belalcázar could not bear the thought of being a subaltern, and his chief Pizarro having failed to make him the governor of Quito, he conceived the idea of pushing northward towards the frontiers of Peru to discover new lands which he could govern with royal license. In Latacunga, Ecuador, Luis de Daza met an Indian who was not a native of that region and who spoke of his country as a land filled with gold and emeralds. He also referred to a peculiar ceremony in which the chief of one of the villages would cover his body with gold dust and then bathe himself in a small lake into which the jewels offered to the gods were thrown. When Belalcázar heard of this tale, he exclaimed, "Let's go and see that gilded man." Hence the name El Dorado was given to the region in search of which so many hardships were suffered by the Spaniards. The chroniclers say this Indian called his country Cundinamarca. Belalcázar now sent Captain Pedro de Añasco to explore the interior, and in his wake Juan de Ampudia, uniting afterward. They marched northward across the southern frontier of Colombia. They passed through the region called Pastos because of its good pasture lands, and attracted by the ornaments of gold plates worn by the inhabitants, descended to the deep valley of the Patia River. After defeating the warlike Patillas, they lingered there for some time. Ampudia explored the valley, which had been abandoned by the natives, who took refuge in the mountains, and found abundant food. He burned and destroyed everything on his way, and his cruelty and destruction were such that Belalcázar, who followed him, and found only blood and desolation. The unhealthful climate of the region served as a sort of protection to the natives. The Indian carriers brought from Quito died. The guide who had given them news of Cundinamarca was a victim of pernicious fevers, and even the Spaniards, in good health and accustomed to fatigue, suffered the effects of that hot valley. Captain Ampudia left Añasco in charge of the baggage and supplies and determined to advance without guides. Near Timbio, he had a hostile encounter and encamped to await Añasco. Joined by him, he proceeded north and shortly afterward reached the beautiful valley of Puebla, where Popayan is now situated. The western Cordillera, with steep sides of moderate height, encloses it on one side, and on the other is the highest range of the Andes, known as the Central Cordillera. The valley, about 8 leagues long and 6 wide, is covered with trees full of flowers and fruit, and through it runs the Cauca River. The conquerors descended to a town of a few thatched circular houses. The principal building was covered by a high roof supported on each side by 400 pillars of considerable size. It was dedicated to public worship, and the drunkenness in which the worshippers indulged recalled the rites of a temple of Bacchus. The Spaniards left the town, camped on the banks of Cauca, and later proceeded to the lands of the chief Jamundi, after whom they named the region and a river. Here a skirmish was fought in which the bellicose Indians were defeated. Ampudia then decided to attract them by flattery, for his soldiers were short of food. In order to comply with Belalcázar's orders to establish a colony, Ampudia descended to the Jamundi River for a distance of several leagues and founded the Villa de Ampudia, which was later moved to another place with another name. Before these events, he had commissioned Francisco de Cieza to explore the east bank of the Cauca. Cieza advanced about 30 leagues to a place near the present city of Carthago. The region visited by him had many settlements. His march was a constant combat, and it is surprising that he was able to return with a handful of soldiers through hostile towns to Ampudia's camp. The only possible explanation, says Acosta, is that the tribes were independent and did not unite to resist the invasion. Acosta calculates that the population of the Valley of the Cauca from Caloto to Anserma Viejo was not less than 1 million. This seems exaggerated, although the region is large and fertile enough to support millions of inhabitants. The savage tribes, independent, bitter enemies of one another, and some of them cannibals, could not have formed a very dense population. Earlier in 1536, Belalcazar, coming with permission of the future Marquess of Peru to subdue the regions north of Quito and govern the towns he might be found as lieutenant of Pizarro, appeared in Ampuria's camp. Belalcazar brought with him a large body of troops. Among his staff officers was the future Marshal Jorge Robledo. As Belalcazar desired to found a town, he carefully examined the region. Under his orders, Captain Miguel Munoz explored a large river having its source in the Quindio Mountains and emptying into the Cauca, a stream now known as La Vieja. Because on its banks, they found an old rich squaw whose jewels they took. Belalcazar himself continued along the west bank of the Cauca, as far as Anserma, where the valley ends and the two cordilleras meet. And now we're on to Cali. After his expeditions on the Cauca, Belalcazar returned to Ampuria's village and decided to move it to Lily Valley, for he thought this was a better location for a way better station between the coast and the interior. Thus, on July 25th of 1536, it says, quote, were laid the first foundations of the town which he called Santiago de Cali. Notwithstanding the prevailing custom observed by the conquerors of establishing a cabildo when founding a town, Belalcazar did not do this in Cali, for he considered it essential to keep all the authority in his own hands. He only appointed Miguel Munoz as lieutenant governor. And this quote is from J. Arroyo, just so everybody understands. Let's continue on. Pursuing his idea of finding an outlet on the Pacific, Belalcazar sent a party across the Cordillera to select a good harbor, but the envoys failed to reach their destination. Although on the return they brought general information regarding the country, which led Munoz to move Cali to its present site, some 30 leagues from the port of Buenaventura. In the process of this second establishment, the Cabildo was organized, the first alcalde being Don Pedro de Ayala. Now we're on to Popayan. This illustrious city, where the cradles of eminent men have rocked, was founded by Belalcazar in December 1536 in the valley of Puebla, or Popayan, as it was called by the Spaniards. The conqueror, with the view of choosing the place best suited for the seat of the government, left the settlers in Cali and returned south with his army, having to fight various battles before being able effectively to occupy the valley of Popayan. He selected the site of the town of Puebla and named the new city Popayan, a name wrongly given to the chief of the region. At first, the town was made up of few thatched huts, grouped together near a hill towards what is now Tulcan, and surrounded by a stockade for defense. This latter measure was soon justified by the repeated attacks of the natives, which continued several months before the final pacification was accomplished. This having been effected, Belalcazar laid out the new city with wide streets. The construction of houses was started forthwith, and a thatched chapel was erected by order of the conqueror on the south side of the plaza. While the inhabitants busied themselves building houses, Belalcazar went in person to explore the land and carry out his plan of finding an outlet to the sea and discovering the vast region to the east. After overcoming great obstacles, he climbed the high mountains at whose base are the sources of the Cauca and the Magdalena, the paramos of Buey and Las Papas. For those of you who want to know, the papa, or the potato, it grows wild in those Andean heights, and the Spaniards called the paramo after it. So continuing on, and then visited Lake Buey, in which the second river takes its rise. Afterwards, he returned to Popayan, intending to undertake a voyage to the Atlantic by following the valley of Magdalena, But as more men and resources would be necessary for this great enterprise, he made up his mind to go on to Quito. And he did this leaving Juan de Ampudia in charge of the government. In order to organize troops, Belacazar needed Pizarro's permission, and with the view of obtaining this, he sent commissioners and eventually went himself to Lima. Perhaps he gained the goodwill of the conqueror of the Incas by a present of gold. In May 1538, he returned to Popayan with well-equipped soldiers, 1,000 Indian carriers, donkeys, cattle, dogs, chickens, and seeds for the colony. Where already there were pigs and mares, which he had brought on the preceding trip. The governments of Popayan and Cali having been set up, Belacazar organized his troops consisting of 100 horse and 200 foot soldiers and set out during the month of July towards the Cordillera. It is probable that he followed the already known to him to the sources of the Cauca and the Magdalena, that he descended along the banks of the Magdalena to the plains of Timana in the department of Julia. Some hold the march was direct from Popayan to La Plata by the Paramo of Guanacas. Be this as it may, the enterprise required 4 months. It is admitted that the expedition crossed the Cordillera to Timana, and that Belacazar did not follow steadily the same side of the river, but changed often. The proof of which is the names given to places on both sides of the Magdalena. It was he who gave the name of Nieva to the rich and extensive plains of that area, doubtless because of their similarity to those crossed to the Nieva River in Santo Domingo, which he knew so well. To assure himself the possession of the territory, he sent back Ampudia and Añasco, the former to an open and guard the way across the Cordillera. The latter found a town for the purpose of establishing communication between the valleys of Popayan and Magdalena, and of effecting the occupation of the country. Early in 1539, Belacazar was making his camp on the banks of Magdalena, where it is joined by the Sabandijas, when he heard that other Spaniards were occupying the highlands, which he was seeking towards the east. So, this is essentially the end of the chapter regarding the Germans. Now, in the final chapter of this book, we are going to go over the conquest of the Muiscas, or I guess the Indians who were living in the northern Andes Mountains in what is now modern-day Bogota, Colombia, which is where most of my Indian ancestors come from. All right. So let me just make something clear while I interject just for 1 second here. It's the fact that when we go over the actual conquest of the Muiscas, there's a few things. So regarding the Jimenez expedition and the conquest of the Muisca territory, there are virtually no accounts of the black slaves, the native carriers like guides, cooks, translators, all of whom probably played very important roles, but it wasn't really mentioned in the story. The story was very much centered on a very select key of number of conquistadors, and it's also important to mention as well that the Muiscas were the only people in which the conquistadors at the time wrote quite a lot about. And we're actually going to go over a few things here, a few observations that the conquistadors made about Muisca civilization. And yeah, I hope you guys enjoy. Let's continue. Now we are on the really interesting part, which is... Oh, and another thing as well, just to contrast. So there are books you can buy of, like, for example, the Conquest of Mexico from, like, the Aztec perspective, since a lot of them, well, some of them wrote down stuff that was going on as it was happening. The Aztecs had their own written language, Nahuatl. And the Muiscas were not like this. While the Muiscas were probably one of the most advanced tribes into all of the Americas, they did not have a written language in the same way that these highly, even more advanced Mesoamericans did. Just want to make that clear. Continuing on. Sada and the conquest of the Chibchas. When the explorers who discovered the junction of the Cauca and the Magdalena returned to Santa Marta, the city was being governed by Don Rodrigo Infante, who during the 3 years of his administration tolerated all kinds of abuses of the Indians. Infante could not and would not control the Spaniards, for he was interested in collecting his share of the proceeds from the sale of Indians and of the gold paid as tribute or derived from robbery. Antonio Bezos succeeded Infante, but nothing worth mentioning occurred during his administration. In 1536, the new governor, Don Pedro Fernandez de Lego, arrived at Santa Marta with a brilliant expedition. The year before, he was governor of the islands of Tenerife and La Palma and Adelanto of the Canary Islands. He had distinguished himself for his bravery and daring in certain enterprises on the African coast. Through a soldier of Bastidas, he had heard about Santa Marta and the vacancy in the government there, and he had sent his son, Alonso Luis, to the court to apply for the post, offering to organize troops to explore the interior of the country. The capitulation between the crown and Fernandez de Lugo was signed in Madrid in 1535. By its terms, he received the title of Adelantado, governor and Capitan General of the province of Santa Marta for the purpose of conquering and settling it, and his son was to be his successor in office. The boundaries with Cartagena were marked by the Magdalena River, but the islands belonged to Santa Marta. Fernandez de Lugo was authorized to make grants of land to the settlers. Fernandez de Lugo brought 1,500 picked men, among whom were Captains Gonzalo Suarez Rendon, Pedro Fernandez de Valenzuela, Martin Galeno, and Lazaro Fante. As Chief Justice came Licenciate Gonzalo Jimenez de Quesada. There was a marked contrast between the inhabitants of the town and the luxury of the newcomers. Scarcity of supplies was soon felt, and dysentery appeared in the colony, carrying away many. But the philanthropy of the governor was revealed, for he administered to the sick even the things he had kept for his personal use. The troops built tents for lodgings, and officers mobilized the soldiers in search of a more helpful location. Moreover, in order to keep the soldiers occupied, Fernandez de Lugo undertook an expedition to the lands of the Bondas, who were becoming a terror, but no results were achieved. The governor returned to Santa Marta and commissioned his son Alonso Luis to proceed with enterprise. The son went up to the region of the Taironas, where he captured some booty, with which, defrauding his father, he secretly sailed for Spain. For this crime, he was tried and acquitted. Afterwards, he came to occupy his father's post. Thus, the only important event during Fernandez de Lugo's administration was the famous expedition of which we were about to speak. He prepared it, but did not live to reap the fruit of the undertaking, as death came to him in Santa Marta in October 1536. On April 1st, 1536, the Siete Don Gonzalo Jimenez de Quesada received from the governor, with the approval of his captains, the appointment as general of the force destined to discover the sources of the Magdalena. By these presents, said the governor, I appoint Licente Jimenez de Quesada as my lieutenant general of the foot, and mounted soldiers who are ready to set out for the discovery of the sources of Rio Grande de la Magdalena. To said Licente, I grant all the powers which I have and hold from His Majesty. End quote. Quesada, without doubt, the most noted among the conquerors of our country, Colombia, and founder of the capital of the Republic, was born in Granada, Spain, about 1499. His father, a native of Cordoba, and his mother, Isabel de Rivera of the same city, were both of good family. Quesada, like his father, was a lawyer, and he exercised his profession before the royal chancellery of Granada until he came over with Fernandez de Lugo. His expedition consisted of 600 foot and 70 mounted soldiers, without counting the men who went up the river in boats. On April 6, 1536, the general left Santa Marta with his land forces. He was accompanied by captains of infantry Suarez Rendon, Fernandez de Valenzuela, Lazaro Fonte, Juan de San Martin, and among others by Gonzalo Garcia, nicknamed El Zorro, or the Fox, who commanded the cavalry. Fray Domingo de las Casas, cousin of the Bishop of Chiapa, and the priest Anton de Lescanes, went along as chaplains. The other part of the expedition, about 200 men, left in 7 boats intending to sail to the mouths of the Magdalena and thence up the river to join Quesada. Only 2 boats under the command of Captain Juan Chamorro succeeded in making their way up the river. 2 or 3 were lost, and the others went to Cartagena and from there to Santa Marta, where 2 barks were fitted out under the direction of Juan Gallegos, with Gomez, Corral, and Juan Albarracin as captains. Gallegos overtook Chamorro in Malambo, and both reached Tamalameque without mishap, this being the point of rendezvous agreed upon with Quesada. After his forces had reunited, the general had to impose his authority to prevent his followers from turning back, for they were disheartened by the great hardships suffered on the overland trip. For the advance expedition, he organized a company of the strongest and hardiest men under Geronimo Inza, who were to open a trail through the virgin forest. He then embarked his sick and ordered the canoes to be brought along for the purpose of crossing the rivers. The rest of the men continued by land along the margin of Magdalena. Those traveling by water discovered a town on the right bank of the stream. When Quesada heard of this, he embarked accompanied by Baltazar Maldonado, Fernan Venegas, Anton Olaya, and others, and soon reached the settlement of Tora called Barranca Bermeja, because of the red color of the banks of the river. Here he waited for the arrival of the land party, but sent men to explore the surrounding country and the river. Days later, they returned with the sad news that the country around Tora was uninhabited. Discontent was growing, and Captain San Martin informed the general, in the name of his companions, that the troops desired to abandon the undertaking and return to Santa Marta. Quesada once more took the situation in hand, with the help of Chaplain Las Casas and several of his friends. Another incursion by Captains Cardosa and Albarracin gave better results. They discovered the Opon River, and on its banks found a hut where there were lumps of salt differing from sea salt. This news changed the feeling among the men, and Quesada promptly sent San Martin to verify the reports and obtain complete information. Going up the river, they found an abandoned canoe which contained red blankets finely woven in more salt. And further on, they reached a town. The general set out to examine the discovery himself, but soon became very sick. However, he ordered Cespedes and Olaya to advance, and they reached the top of the Sierra, from which they saw the lands, and they were said to be rich and densely inhabited. Quesada was able to return to Tora, where he ordered Gallegos to proceed to Santa Marta with the flotilla and the 6 soldiers. Then, forgetting his own ailments, Quesada started up the Atuncieras, and after surmounting the difficulties of a long and hazardous journey, reached the fertile lands where Velez was later founded. The change could not have been more attractive for the Spaniards. Abundance succeeded scarcity. The hot and unhealthful climate was exchanged for the pleasant and invigorating air of the new lands. Great enthusiasm for the party, which had been reduced to 166 thin and weak men with 60 horses. And I want to just make something clear here. It says, Don Juan de Castellanos, who is the chronicler here that is being cited, he enumerates the difficulties in this manner. So he's talking about like marshes, swamps, lakes, inaccessible passes and mountains, wariness from the plague, like sickness was a huge thing. Many people think of like smallpox killing Indians, and that's very much true, and it did. But in these tropical areas of like South America, Europeans were getting decimated by things like, diseases like malaria and things similar to that. I actually go into a lot of this stuff in my book review on slavery in Chocó, which explains why so many black slaves from Africa needed to be brought in this part of the world, because a lot of these Europeans were just dying of tropical sicknesses, especially in places that were hard to develop. And then basically, you had all sorts of things. You had plague, you had ticks, bats, mosquitoes, serpents, you had crocodiles, you had tigers that would literally eat people while it would be raining horribly at night. It was it was bad. And hunger was, obviously something that was bad too. You had jaguars killing people at night along with, tigers. And yeah, this is sort of the stuff you were dealing with on a nightly basis. In fact, it was said so bad that the noise it would thunderstorm so hard at night that jaguars would eat people alive and you wouldn't even hear it. That's how bad it was. And I'm not making this up. This is well cited and it's well documented as a part of the expedition and the conquest here. So now on to the next page we have here, continuing on. After several days of rest, the expedition continued the march towards the south, arriving without difficulties at the town of Uzaza, near the Saravita or Suarez River. The settlement had been abandoned by its inhabitants upon learning about the approach of the foreigners. The information obtained regarding the riches and the fertility of the soil was more pleasing each day, and the fear of the natives for the strangers was slowly disappearing. They thought that the horse and the man on his back were one, and were so frightened when they saw the cavalry coming that they would fall with their faces on the ground. They also thought the Spaniards were cannibals, and as a test sent to them a man and a woman in fetters, and a deer. Of course, the animal was eaten by the conquerors, and the two prisoners released and set free. This test, and the help given by the Spaniards days later in putting out a fire in a house, led the Indians to trust the strangers in spite of the profound awe with which they viewed them. The journey was continued to the towns of Moniquira, Susa, Tinjaca, and Coachera, where the chaplains left a cross in the temple consecrated to the sun. Then Lenguasaque, Cucunuba, and Suisca were visited. In these towns, the savages came out to welcome Quesada and brought deer, rabbits, vegetables, and clothes of varied colors to his camp. From various places came Indians to serve and entertain the newcomers. It happened in Suisca that an Indian bringing 2 blankets to the Spanish camp met Juan Gordo, one of the soldiers on the way, and was so scared that he left them on the trail and fled. Gordo took them, and the owner then went to Quesada and complained that the soldier had taken the blankets away from him. The general condemned Gordo to death and executed him as an example to the rest. From Suesca, they set out for Nemocon. It was in this place that the salt was made, which had guided the conquerors since they began that painful ascent of the Opon. Here they discovered that the plains were more spacious and saw many towns with houses of every aspect. This was a matter of rejoicing for the Spaniards, who unexpectedly, however, had to match arms with the natives. These Tescusa, Zipa, or Lord of Bacada, and learning of the invasion, determined to defend the Chibcha nation and sent to the field over 500 picked warriors, who carried in the vanguard the mummies of their chiefs who had distinguished themselves in battle. The Indians, full of courage, attacked Quesada's rear guard on its way to Zipaquira, but the Spaniards gained a complete triumph without their Let me just say this as well, just so everybody understands, when you're talking about like the Lord of Bacada, which I believe is also it's synonymous with the Lord of Bogota. Bacada was the name given to the main settlement of the Muisca Confederation on the Bogota Savannah. Just so everybody understands this. This was around, I think we have an elevation of around like 8,366 feet, according to Google here. So yeah, just wanted to make that known. We are basically in what people think of as the capital of Colombia, which is very different geographical sort of piece of land compared to what people are stumbling into in the tropical conditions of the coast. So let's continue on here. Reinforcements which arrived after the combat. The defeated Indians took refuge in the fortress of Busangot with the Zipa, which the Zipa had in Jica. The fortification was made of large logs several meters high and interwoven cane, and it was covered with long pieces of cotton cloth. The next day, the natives sallied forth from their entrenchments and after a short engagement were again defeated, the victors taking possession of the stronghold and occupying the town of Chilla. From Chía, Quesada admired the beauty of the great sabana and the fertility of the fields, and which were seen here and there, some in groups, others isolated, many houses which resembled chateaux. These belonged to the Indian chiefs and were near the town. Piedrahita says that, quote, uniform construction of the great enclosures thrilled the Spaniards, for besides the peculiar workmanship which was revealed, there proceeded from each enclosure a road 5 varas wide and half a league long, so well constructed and straight that even though it went up or down a hill, a perfect straight line was preserved, end quote. The similarity of these constructions to forts or alcazares suggested a name given to the region by the conqueror, namely Valley of the Alcazares. The extensive plain enjoys a benign climate with an average temperature of 14 or 15 degrees centigrade. So for you Fahrenheit people here that are listening, we're talking about 60 degrees Fahrenheit. The weather in this part of the Andes is very, very agreeable. 60 to 70 degrees all year. It's, during the day, obviously. It gets colder at night, but that's a lot easier to manage in certain ways than the climate that you see outside of, these mountains where it feels like it's 100 degrees like all year and it's tropical storms. And I've lived through it myself in Colombia. I remember I spent the summer in Cali where every single day, almost at the exact same time, almost around like 1 or 12, there'd be like a horrible, like almost tropical storm, and it would pass, but you would just look forward to it. It was just a thing, right? Anyway, continuing on, it extends 16 leagues from north to south and 8 from east to west. In the town of Chía, Quesada rested, celebrating Holy Week on April of 1537. The son and his successor of the Chibcha chief, who lived there, hid his treasures and fled, and his vassals offered no resistance. The chief of Suba came to meet the conquerors with presents of gold and emeralds, conducting them to lodgings where they spent several days. The chief died when he could have been very useful to the Spaniards as an intermediary between them and the Zipa. He had been baptized, and the Spaniards paid fitting tribute to his body. Quesada now broke camp and proceeded to Bacada, capital of the empire, which was occupied without resistance, for Tisquescuas and his people, after trying to burn the town, had abandoned it. Bacada had become the largest and most important of the Chibcha settlements. The invaders made their quarters in the royal palace, but the coveted treasure of the chief was not to be found. The general afterward ordered an exploration to the west of the territory and detailed for this purpose captains Cespedes and San Martin. These, guided by some Chibchas, penetrated the territory of the Panches, and after a terrible encounter, returned to the Sabana. Learning of the emerald mines at Somondoko, the conqueror decided to march in search of them after having made his entry into the territory of the rich Bocaca chief. From the center of the operations, in Bacata, he proceeded to the towns of Guasca, Guatavita, Chococonta, and Tomorque. He then passed through Tensa and Garago, and, being near the mines, decided to send a commissioner in search of them. The party reached Somondoko and returned bringing good samples of the precious stones and news of having seen from the neighboring hills the extensive eastern plains. This report led to the San Martin's expedition to explore this region. He went as far as Iza, where he heard of this powerful chief, Tundama, and returned without accomplishing his purpose. In the meantime, Quesada, with some infantry and cavalry, had marched on Hunza, residence of the powerful Zake, Quimenquatatocha. And this is the title of the other ruler, that of the Southern Chibcha Confederation, the Iraka, which was the principal religious leader, and he spent much of his time and effort to keep the peace between the Sipa and the Zake. This is a confederation of Indians we're talking about. These are the most advanced ones in Colombia. The journey was made rapidly in order to reach there in the daylight and assure the success of the attack. The Zake, hearing of the approach of the Spaniards, ordered many Indians to go out and meet them with presents of cloth and food, and to entertain and delay them while the treasures were being carried to a place of safety. When the royal messengers left Hunza, the conquerors were already approaching the royal mansion, and the battle was about to begin. The sight of the palace decorated with gold plates and pieces of fine gold hanging from the doors, treasures which glittered in the afternoon sun and jingled when swayed by the breeze, cheered the Spaniards on to the combat. After a desperate encounter, they subdued the natives, broke the doors of the mansion, and entered the interior. The booty captured was so large that the horsemen on one side of the pile, collected in the patio, could not see those on the other side. Learning that in Suamos there was a rich temple dedicated to the sun, Quesada started forward, leaving the Zaque a prisoner, whom they continued to treat with consideration due to his rank. Quesada was in search of the lands of the famous Sugamuxi. The Spaniards passed through Paipa and entered the domains of Chief Tundama, who fled with his treasures. Reaching the Iraca Valley one afternoon, they found Indians in battle array and easily defeated them. That night they entered the deserted town of Sogamoso, and in the enclosure of the Cacique, as well as in some of the houses, they collected a good quantity of gold, plate, and jewels. The conquerors then returned to Hunza, set the Zaque free, and started out to visit the valley of the Niva, having been attracted by the riches said to exist there. In the plain of Bonza, a bloody encounter was fought with the Tundama, who commanded numerous troops in person. Quesada was in danger of being killed, but managed as usual to win the victory. The march was then continued to Suesca, where the general headquarters was established. With a few soldiers, Quesada rapidly crossed the Sabana, descended to the town of Pasca, and afterward visited the hot regions of the Magdalena. This expedition was disastrous, for all the men fell sick, some died, and the rest were forced to return to the plateau. The valley of Niva, which left such unhappy memories with Quesada, was named the Valley of Sorrows. In Bacata, the general joined his brother Hernan Perez, and there received news that Tisquesusa, with his court, was in a fortress named Facatativa. He left with a few men for this new campaign and marching at night assaulted the mansion of the Zipa, who in the confusion of the fight while trying to escape was killed by a dart and secretly buried by his followers. The victors found many cotton blankets, some food, and a little gold, but not the famed treasures of the Zipa. After the death of the Zipa, his subjects renewed the war with ardor. Quesada, who was in a difficult position, moved his camp to Bosa, on the banks of the Tonjulo River, where the cavalry could maneuver without being hampered by lagoons and swamps. Later, he had to take part in the war of the Chibchas with the terrible Panches, who were preparing to invade their territory. Putting aside the rightful heir, the Chibchas had elected Sagipa to succeed Tisquesusa, the previous Zipa. But as the election did not satisfy all, discontent was rife at the very time the Panchi invasion was at the gates of the empire. These dangers obliged Sagipa to make peace with the Spaniards. To announce his coming, he sent messengers followed by servants with presents of cloth, gold, and emeralds, and finally, he himself made his appearance in the Spanish camp at Bosa, accompanied by his lords. He was well received. The terms of peace were agreed upon, and some days later, Sagipa asked Quesada for help against the Panchis, who had already raided Chibcha territory and carried away many prisoners. With 12,000 Indians and a few Spaniards, Quesada descended to the land of the Panchis, defeated them at Tocarema, and compelled them to sue for peace. Greed tarnished Quesada, as it did many other brilliant conquerors. Unquenchable thirst for gold led to the worst extremes of cruelty. In Bojaca, while celebrating the victory over the Panchis, Quesada ordered the arrest of his friend and ally, Sagipa, with the purpose of compelling him to surrender the treasures of Tisquesusa. Sagipa and other chiefs were finally tortured to death or hung, but they revealed no secrets regarding the coveted gold. Now we're on to this final section here of the conquest of the Chibchas called the founding of Bogota. Quesada was thinking of going to the court to respect his achievements and seek the privilege of governing the lands he had conquered. But before leaving, he decided to found a town where his troops could be left during the voyage to Spain. For this purpose, he proceeded to select a site at the foot of the Sierra, where there was a village, Tesusaquillo, in which was located at the Zipa's mansion of retreat. Here the soil was fertile, the water abundant and pure, and buildings materials plentiful. The site could also be easily defended. After taking possession of the place in the name of the sovereign, Charles V, the general ordered the construction of the 12 houses, which were considered enough to accommodate his forces. The first church on the site of the present cathedral was also erected, and Father Las Casas said the first Mass on August 6, 1538. From this date is reckoned the founding of the city of Santa Fe, which place later took the name of Bogota. To all the conquered area, the general gave the name of Nuevo Reino de Granada. Quesada did not organize a civil government, but left the region under military rule. Quesada then placed his brother Hernan Perez in charge of the government in Santa Fe, and started with a few companions towards the north, with the view of descending the Magdalena and proceeding to Spain. Several days after his departure, he learned that Captain Lazaro Fonte would denounce him upon his arrival at the coast for having concealed many emeralds without paying the royal share. The general decided at once to return to Santa Fe, where he had Fonte tried for a like crime and sentenced to death, but through the intervention of friends and appeal to the king, was allowed on condition that Fonte should stay with the Pasca Indians, who were then at war with the Spaniards. Early in 1539, Quesada received a message from the exile Fonte in which informed him of the approach of a Spanish force over the Paramos of Sumapaz. Setting Fonte free, he ordered several of his trusted captains to investigate what was happening. In fact, the force which was approaching was that under Nicholas Fetterman, who, as had been said, had remained in Nuestra Senora de la Fragua on the eastern plains. The German had left the plains, ascended Sumapaz, and descended with his naked troops along the course of the Fusagasugá River to Pasca. Many of the soldiers covered themselves with the skins of animals and wore moccasins of the same material. The general made preparations to go forward to meet Fetterman in battle array, accompanied by several chiefs with their armed forces. When Quesada reached the fields of Bosa, the German appeared with several horsemen and the captains previously sent by Quesada. The interview of the two leaders was very formal. They aligned from their horses and embraced each other, offering mutual friendship. Then they remounted their animals and took the road to Santa Fe. Quesada, who already knew that other Spaniards were camping on the banks of the Magdalena, hurried arrangements with Fetterman in order to be sure of his support. In fact, he gave him 10,000 pesos in gold and agreed that the soldiers from Venezuela should have the same privileges enjoyed by those of Nueva Granada. After having made the pact with the German, Quesada sent his brother to the camp of the unknown force of the Magdalena in order to secure information as to its object and present the commander with a gift of gold and emeralds. The messenger met Sebastián de Belalcázar in his camp and at the junction of the Sabandijas and the Magdalena. Belalcázar, who had heard of the troops of Spaniards in the highlands of the interior, received Hernan Perez courteously and told him that he did not intend to contest Quesada's rights, but only wished an unobstructed passage to continue his search for El Dorado. However, when he was informed by the Indians of the approach of Fetterman, he changed his mind and attempted an alliance with him against Quesada. He moved rapidly to Bosa, whence he sent Captain Juan de Cabrera to request Quesada's surrender of the territory, alleging that it was within Pizarro's jurisdiction. Quesada bluntly refused. The dispute dragged on, but owing to Fetterman's unwillingness to accept Belalcázar's offer of alliance and the valuable influence of the chaplains, Pizarro's lieutenant gave in. The chaplains proposed the basis for an understanding, which were as follows. 1. The three generals would go to Spain to present their claims. 2. Belalcázar's soldiers would stay in Nueva Granada with the rights of the conquerors. 3. The territory would be governed by Hernan Perez during the absence. 4. The valley of Nieva would be included in the territory of Peru. In this manner, peace was ensured. Although Quesada offered gold to Belacazar, the latter refused it with noble pride, in order that it might not be said that his men were mercenaries fighting under another standard. The three conquerors entered Santa Fe amidst popular rejoicing over the peace which had been made, and the horsemen entertaining themselves for several days in their chase and in other sports. It is remarkable that these three leaders, coming from such distant regions, should have met here with approximately the same number of men, each carrying two chaplains as well, the one a regular and the other a secular priest. However, there was a marked difference in their dress. Quesada's men wore cotton clothes made by the Indians, Fetterman's were dressed in hides, while Belacazar's wore fine scarlet and silk. While ships were being rigged in Guataqui and the Magdalena, for the trip to Spain, Quesada turned his attention to his colony, seeking the advice of Belacazar. The latter thought that the colonization system should not consist in the establishment of simple commercial factories or mere fortresses to be used as bases for further expeditions, but that it should involve the appropriation of the land and its distribution among the settlers and soldiers in order to induce them to abandon the life of adventure, to acquire habits of industry, and thus to become interested in the progress of their adopted country. Quesada followed these wise suggestions and proceeded solemnly to organize the city as the capital of the new Kingdom of Granada, at the same time authorizing Gonzalo Suarez and Martin Galeano each to found another city. In April 1539, in the presence of the three conquerors, there took place the solemn juridical acts usually performed at the founding of a new town. At this time, Quesada established a civil government. He appointed Geronimo de Inza and Juan de Arevalo as alcaldes. He organized an ayuntamiento with 7 councilors, appointing Juan Rodriguez Benavides as secretary and Baltasar Maldonado alcalde mayor. He named Hernan Perez lieutenant general with the approval of the cabildo. He marked the streets and distributed house lots, and lastly, he appointed Father Juan Verdejo, Fetterman's chaplain, as curate, since Father Las Casas was returning to Spain. In May of the same year, the three conquerors left Santa Fe for Spain. In descending for Magdalena, they encountered several obstacles. At Honda, they had to disembark and transport their boats and baggage by land to the other side of the falls. Having evaded this peril, they had several encounters with the Indians, who pursued them in canoes and boarded their vessels. Early the next month, they arrived at Cartagena, where they were received with evidence of admiration, but the fame of the rich lands discovered had reached Santa Marta, and its new governor, Geronimo Lebrun, decided to proceed to the interior and claim them as part of his territory. From Cartagena, Quesada sent messengers to him, protesting that the lands were outside of his jurisdiction and declaring that his authority would not be recognized there. In July, the three conquerors sailed for Spain and eventually reached the port of Sanlúcar de Barrameda. Okay, so yeah, so here's the thing. After Colombia is essentially taken, right? Or not Colombia, after Bogota has been successfully conquered, the rest of the conquest was a cakewalk. And because the people, the Muiscas, decided to join with the Spanish in order to defeat the Panches, this made it even easier for the Spaniards to, further take over the rest of what is now modern day Colombia. So now I'm going to go over a few things, and I put in the StreamYard link in case anyone wants to join at this point. And I think there's a few things that I think you guys would find interesting regarding like the actual way that the Muisca Indians used to live in the past. So they had for example, when it came to the topic of like religion, right? They had very much a highly organized and complex religion that was common to this entire confederation. You had, the Muiscas believed in a creator who created all of nature. They believed in the concept of the immortality of the soul, and the resurrection of the body, and a universal judgment, believe it or not. Men who died in battle and women who died in childbirth were exempt from judgment from their sins. And they would have enormous wooden temples, uh, places specifically and you'd find the best temples in like Bogota, Guatavita, Sogamoso. And what's interesting as well is the fact that the Muiscas also have a tale of the flood. At one time, an evil supernatural being caused the plains of Bogota to be flooded, forcing the people to flee to the mountains. And these people were also idol worshippers as well. So they had, for example, they made idols, they made figures of like the sun and the moon and of like human beings. These were usually carved poorly. Actually reminds me a lot of like Nordic carvings that I saw whenever I was in Finland and I visited some museums there. You had a lot of carvings that the Nordic people made as well in these forests that were abundant with trees. And each Muisca had sort of an individual idol of his own that was always with him, which this transition made a lot easier for introducing the concept of patron saints, for example, to the Muisca Indians. And the priests, they were also people that were expected to practice, for example, celibacy. The priests would make human sacrifices as well. And there was another thing as well where, how do I put this? You had like complex rules regarding like a lot of things in society that many probably wouldn't have even thought that the Indians would do. Some things would be completely just out there. So what do I mean by that? So for example, if we talk about like murder would carry the death penalty in Muisca society. Now, also, you had a loophole though, where if a wife, father, or close relative of the murder person, if they wanted to pardon the murderer, they weren't allowed to do so. They had this idea that the Supreme Being gave life, and man did not have the power to forgive one who took life away, regardless of what the victims thought. Then, for example, you have things like the concept of rape. So if rape was committed by a man who had never been married, they would give him the death penalty. But if rape were committed by a married man, the punishment in Muisca society would be to have two bachelors who have never been married to sleep with the offender's wife. Why was this the case? Because this was considered to be worse than death. And for example, on the topic of incest, for example, incest with a mother, daughter, sister, niece, this was punished by putting the guilty parties in the water with the victims. A lattice-like cage was placed over the top, and the criminal would usually be left to perish miserably. It's also important to mention as well, homosexuality carried a death penalty. And the Spaniards were actually impressed by this because in many places that were nearby, Indians that were nearby the Muiscas, they were much more likely to actually practice homosexuality openly without any taboos. So the Muiscas were unique in their own way, in which that they did not tolerate the sort of sexual act compared to the surrounding neighbors. It was also ordered, for example, if someone were a thief, you were to basically put his eyes out by fire. If this was really grave, or if he kept repeating it, eventually the eyeballs were to be punctured out with thorns. But usually they'd allow the criminal to remain alive, just so everybody understands. Now, those who showed cowardice when called to war for the Muiscas, these were people so they had a punishment specifically. They would essentially make these cowards wear the clothes of women and make them do women work for the entirety of the war as a sort of like public humiliation. In terms of weapons, you didn't have a lot of complex stuff. You had like those wooden sticks that people would kind of use like clubs. You'd have like bows and arrows, and they would actually run around with with their dead ancestors, sort of like almost like a mummy on their back, which was common with more Indian tribes than just the Muiscas as well. Now, here's what's kind of what a lot of people don't know, which is really interesting, is that they had a really unique way of picking new leaders. So you might be thinking, what do I mean by that? So if there was ever a situation where, there was no really way, there was no like direct heir to whoever is going to be the ruler, they would kind of try to narrow it down to two specific people. Once these two specific people once they narrowed it down to these people, they did a very, very weird test. And what am I talking about? So lust for women was considered by the Muiscas to be a great source of danger in a ruler. They didn't want a Kumar or someone who basically could easily just get seduced by a woman and compromise him and the entire nation. So control of sexual manifestations was considered a great value. So in the event that a ruler or chief died without an heir, they would get the two people and they would bring these two potential rulers to essentially to the priest class. And the priests would basically trot out beautiful maidens in front of these two people. Now, these two potential rulers would have to be naked during this. But essentially, the priests would trot out these very, like the most beautiful women they could find of the Muiscas. And they would basically make them, get these maidens to be within very close distance to the potential rulers. To contest, so basically out of the two people, the one who exhibited the least signs of actual sexual excitement was the winner. And if both failed, they would just keep doing a new pair until someone would be able to resist their urges, essentially. A lot of people don't know that, and it wouldn't shock me that they didn't know that. This is a very obscure tribe that most people just know nothing about. So yeah, with that being said, it's important to understand as well that the Panchis, the people who were the sworn enemies of the Muiscas, these people were much better at fighting than the Muiscas. I mean, it's kind of almost like a joke, really, you could make, where it's like the Chad Panchis versus the Virgin Muiscas. The Muiscas were a lot more intelligent. They were a lot more book smart. They were much more civilizationally advanced. They were living in the mountains. And then you had the Panchis who were not from the mountains. These were people who would run around completely naked. They would only cover their private parts. Their weapons were way more lethal. They'd fight with things like bows and arrows. And they were constantly terrorizing the shit out of these Muisca Indians. It's like these Muiscas were very weak compared to the Panchis. And now, the Panchis also had a lot of really interesting things that they do as well, where I believe they would actually, if there was ever a situation where like they needed to, I guess, give their enemies like maybe a message or something, they would use women for that, which is interesting. And the Panchis also would fight in complete silence. They did not like to make a lot of noise as well. So that's basically everything that we have here. I have the StreamYard link here for anybody that wants to join in. I don't think anybody really does. I'm going to give it like 5 more minutes. And if not, I'm going to just end the stream and that'll be that. But I hope this was enlightening for the people that stuck around and listened to the whole thing. I had to do the pre-recorded audio that I recorded because it was just going to be impossible to read all of that live. It's not easy to read and talk and provide commentary to what you're reading without just wearing out your vocal cords. So I found like this would be a good alternative. So I'm going to read some comments here in the chat while we're waiting. So we have kind of off topic. My uncle has property. So yeah, Big Franco, I have sent you some things in the chat regarding places you might want to visit in Colombia. It's been a while since I've been, over 5 years. I need to go soon. Was Brazil part of a pre-European empire? I don't know anything about the Brazilian Indians. I just don't. Maybe one day I can talk about it, but it's just not something that I know very much about at all. Now, let's see here. Gran Colombia stream when? I'm going to have to do a lot more research before we start talking about the topic of Gran Colombia. But yeah, since I don't think we have any more comments or any more really people that want to join in and chat in StreamYard, I'm going to just call this a day. And I hope you guys enjoy the rest of your week. I hope to have a few extra projects coming out real soon. I was just taking a pretty long break, but I appreciate everyone who followed me to this channel and who decided to listen to this. So yeah, let's end the podcast right here.